Excelsior, everyone. SaveTheWeak here, ready to entertain you once again with another thrilling audiobook. Today we dive into What If Tanya Invaded Yggdrasil? One-shot. A gripping one-shot that's sure to leave you on the edge of your seat. Before we jump in, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button to show your support. Also, be sure to check the description for more details and to support the brilliant author behind this breathtaking masterpiece. Now, without further ado, let's begin.
Chapter 1. Divine Intervention. Strategic Command were short-sighted fools. Sure, they had achieved victory over the Francios Republic, but their short-sightedness blinded them to all outcomes of victory. They had overlooked the large forces amassing at Africa. They had failed to eliminate all forces after the capturing of Parisy, and had even rejected the voto restitutio ad integrum proposed by the Commonwealth. Now, all guns were pointing towards them. The Commonwealth, the Russie Federation, the Unified States of America, and the Francios Republic forces in Africa were loading their guns and slowly aiming it at the drunken empire. The outcome of such war against them could only have three feasible outcomes: white peace, foreign capitulation, and internal civil war. Now strategic headquarters were in a panic that could have been prevented if they had simply eradicated the enemy forces while they were in transit or accepted the return of the status quo. Tanya sighed as she cleaned her weapons. It was no use cursing her superiors for their blunder. Her whole battalion was apprehensive, and the general consensus, from what she had heard, was that they were tired of fighting. She was as well. The whole empire was tired of fighting. The soldiers in the front lines were tired of the cold meals and the separation from their homes, and the families of the soldiers wanting them back. Yet the nationalism was unwavering, unyielding. The whole continuation of the war was something she personally blamed being X for. Childish as it may seem, she had no doubt that he at least provided inspiration for the leader of the Francios resistance just to spite her. A shiver traveled up her spine, causing her to freeze. A mysterious sense of unease had filled her. Then she noticed something off about her room. It was darker. She turned her attention to her window. Perhaps something was blocking the sunlight to her room? No, the thing she found wasn't an object. It was a starry night sky. She blinked a bit, rubbed her eyes, and slapped herself all in the effort of checking if she was dreaming. It wasn't a dream. Her mind went blank as she heard nothing. Absolute silence. Not even the passing cars or the distinct chatter entered her ears, only silence. Her eyes narrowed in absolute fury. Damn you. Being X. July 21st, 12:32 CET. Day has become night. Night has become day. The surrounding countries have seemingly disappeared or have flooded over. Tanya took in the sight before her. A mountain cut in half. It was as if someone just lifted the empire and plopped it down in the middle of the ocean. The massive cliff gave no regard to terrain, seemingly just cut the empire out solely based on the empire's pre-war political map. She cursed being X. Was he willing to go this far just to incite her devotion? Well, he could shove his godhood up his ass for all she cared. Sir, incoming unidentified vessel. Tanya was ripped from her musings with the alert from one of the many faces she couldn't plaster a name on for sure. You two, with me. Everyone else stand by and keep a lookout for any anomalies, she swiftly ordered, plucking Visha and Voreen to follow her. A resounding, "Yes, sir," greeted her ears. As she took off towards the vessel, she took in all details of it. To say the least, she scoffed. It seemed to be bigger than a normal wooden fishing boat, or some sort of recreation of an old from around the 17th century without the cannons. The strangest thing of it all, there was a menacing crossbow with archers with bows strung. Sensing this somewhat dangerous situation, Tanya held up her fist to halt the other two. She sighed, motioning for Visha to hand over the radio microphone. Unidentified vessel, this is Major de Gurishaf of the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion. Stand down and surrender your vessel for inspection under the Wartime Suspicion Act. No response. Bows were still stung and pointed. Owain repeat, This is Major Degurashov of the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion. Stand down and surrender your vessel for inspection. No response. Now they were loading the bestia-looking thing. Perhaps their radio is broken? She cleared her throat. Sighed. I repeat. This is Major Degurashov of the R&D Aerial Mage Battalion. Stand down and surrender your vessel for inspection. The crew looked confused for a moment, yet some trigger-happy fools fired the ballista, which unsurprisingly lost momentum immediately from firing upwards and had only crossed half the distance between them before falling. Downwards. Tanya clicked in annoyance, lifting her rifle and pointing at the rearming bestia. She supposed that simply destroying the ballista would suffice for her point. Once she activated her spell and fired, the ballista turned into rubble. Unassume hostile, capture and detainment priority. Lethal force only tolerated when actually threatened. She put an extra emphasis on the tactually. Yes, sir? Visha and Voreen replied as they honed in on the boat, determined to carry out her orders. Tanya supposed this was a good break for them. Vice, she called. Yes, sir. Sir, patrols along the coast with the battalion. For now, be on alert for any more. Vessels like these, if you find any, simply destroy anything resembling a heavy-duty weapons and apprehend the crew. Yes, sir. As Weiss went to instruct the battalion, Tanya couldn't help but look at the sky and release a breath. Jet lag. I don't even think that term is used yet, she groaned. It was determined by Strategy HQ that the difference in time between the old time and the new one was 7 hours. It was around nighttime in Set. Major. Tanya's focus returned back to the wooden ship, her eyes landing on Visha, who waved her over. Landing on the ship, Tanya observed the detained crew of the wooden vessel, many of which were unconscious, while the one conscious looked at her with mixed emotions. Report, she commanded fluently, snapping a quick salute. Returning the salute, Visha gave her the debrief. I know firearms located in plain sight, and all types of weapons are either a bow, a sword, or an antique magical scepter. Tanya rose an eyebrow at the last item. Antique magical scepter? Yes, sir. It would seem the captain of the ship was a mage of some sorts. Was she educated, or was she simply throwing magic around? Well, you see, most of her attacks were unconventional. She was attacking with what seemed to be an acid arrow. Acid? Arrow? Bisha nodded. Did it penetrate your shield? She shook her head. Tanya massaged her temples before sighing. Where is she detained? By the wheel, sir. She nodded before walking off, giving orders to Visha and Voreen to secure the captives and taking them on shore to transport them for interrogation by the Empire's intelligence office. She looked at the mysterious mage captain. Can you understand me? She inquired. The captain just looked at her with a mix of confusion and disdain before nodding slowly. What is your name? She looked at her with suspicion before clearing her throat before answering. I am Captain Avarus Isesgas. Now unhand me, child. Tanya stared blankly at her. This and Captain is going to be a pain in the ass, but perhaps she could use Avarice's pride against her? Tanya entered the captain's cabin and strode in. Spotting what she sought, she looked it over. Her eyes scrutinized the map in front of her. The general shape of the continent almost entirely mimicked the Middle East. The only thing that differentiated it from the region was the separation from any other landmass like Russia, India, Europe, or Africa. Of course, she didn't just take Avarice's word and the map in front of her as truth. She rummaged through Avarice's things before finding what looked like a journal. Opening it, she paused on the first page. A different language. She groaned and decided to simply pocket it to give to the intelligence office. Looking around, she exited the cabin. She motioned for her battalion to move out. She would let the Navy and Army deal with the ship. Her? She was just going to head back, report what she saw and the incident before getting some rest to get accustomed to the different time zone. She was going to flail being alive when she ever got the chance. Today was the longest day of her life. There was no doubt in that sentence. After the mission, They had been ordered to only sleep when it was actually dark. Not when they were tired, but when it struck. In the new time zone. They were in a state of emergency, so it was imprudent to get accustomed. She flopped on her bed, her eyes closing for rest. Finally, rest. Night had come slowly for her, as there wasn't much to do besides maintenance and other shenanigans. "How was your stay here?" Her eyes widened, then narrowed as she sat up. "Being X," she growled, "and 'tis useless to look for me. You seem to have thrown away anything fitting for me to possess." The amusement in being X's voice was not lost to her. "And as much I would love to goad you, I have many new prayers to fulfill. So, why do you bother?" She knew he was wearing a sadistic smile. She just feels it. "Why? Well, then ask you a simple question. Do you have faith in me now?" With that sentence, her power rose, and with iron gripping her voice, she said, "No." "A shame that you still question my position as God." Being X's voice now came from one direction instead of around her. He took possession as her Operation Orb. "It would also be a shame if you were deployed tomorrow, would it not?" Tanya was tempted to smash the orb to pieces, but the logical reasons won against her raging urge to destroy it. "Damn you, being X and sent." There was no response to her curse. Lieutenant General Rudersdorf and Lieutenant General Zetor ate their late dinner in relative silence, their moods not yet content to start up much conversation. Rudersdorf was first to finish and allowed his dishes to be removed. "Today was long, wasn't?" he asked tiredly. Zetor finished his food before speaking. "Once yes, today was the longest day of the Empire." He wiped his mouth with a napkin, allowing the servers to take his dishes. "Have you read the reports?" "I have. To be surrounded by all sides by water like the Commonwealth. It is a surprise to be sure, and a relatively unwelcome one at that. Don't even get me started on our new location." Major de Gurechaff seemed to have captured what appears to be some sort of ship captain mage. "So I have heard." It would seem the intelligence office was elated to receive such a helpful source of information. They have also determined that any of the crew from her ship as well herself are not speaking German. Their mouths do not move in the words they speak. This phenomenon, as she explained, was natural in her world. At that sentence, both men fell into silence. Rudersdorf popped out a cigarette and puffed it. "Poor. Tues isn't just the Empire's longest day, it's the longest year." "Indeed. So should we send an expedition force? Almost a quarter of our men has vanished and a half have been relieved of their duties just mere hours ago." Both grimaced at the thought. It would be for the best just to send the African expedition. Indeed, after all, they were already geared for the venture, were they not? Chapter 2. Falling Horses. Naval vessels were by far the worst transport when it came to comfortability. The trips were long, rocky, and unpredictable. Of course, they were still used not only because it was effective in ferrying a large number of people and heavy equipment, but because it was relatively easy to coordinate a fleet of these things. They also could pack a very heavy punch if they have weapons. For those reasons alone, Tanya chose not to speak up her distaste on the long trip to the northern part of the new continent. "Land," she heard, dragging her attention away from the small port window to the upper deck. As she arrived on the deck, she heard multiple cheers as the army celebrated. Of course, some of the Navy crew members celebrated as well, but most of them were too busy to celebrate. Yet, the fleet stopped a few miles away from the shallow areas. Eventually, the army took note of the very far distance of land. "Che? Do they expect us to row our way to there from here?" One soldier asked in disbelief. Multiple groans were emitted from the people on the deck. Yet, with her more keener, enhanced eyesight, she saw figures, horse riders. "Major von de Gurechaff, ma'am. Head of Operations General von Rommel requests your presence." Once she entered the citadel of one of the transport ship, she took note of the distant heated debates in a closed-off room on her immediate left. The voices were muted enough that she could not hear what they were talking about. Major von de Gurschaf of the Imperial 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion, reporting in, Sir, she said promptly to the head of the expedition, General von Rommel. He simply nodded before pointing to the cliffs. Did you notice the silhouettes on top of the cliffs? He inquired, his eyes scanning her. And did take note of them before I was called in, sir, Tanya replied truthfully. The general merely nodded in approval before turning his back to her. Well, I am entrusting you to initiate the first contact with them, he revealed, his eyes peering through his binoculars. Do as you wish, you shall dictate on our policy going forward. Was he testing her? Tanya blinked. With all due respect, sir, I am not qualified to open the first contact with the natives, she protested. Rommel merely hummed in the face of her protests. Wenji Nang Sheltai shall take responsibility, he replied smoothly. I have an inkling feeling that you will do wonderful. You are dismissed, Major. Tanya snapped a salute before heading down. Once she was out of sight, she bit down on her fingernail in frustration and deep thoughts. The Major seems a bit calmer recently, don't you think so, Lieutenant Weiss? Visha inquired from the solemn-faced man. Weiss nodded. It should be expected, after all. Since we're no longer on the battlefield, there is no reason for stress. Even I feel lighter than usual, don't you? He asked the people to his sides, Visha included. Simple nods, shrugs, and hums greeted his question. Reorganize yourselves. You all look like a mass of undisciplined civilians, Tanya ordered, snapping the battalion from their pleasant talks. Yes, sir. With the order given, the battalion split into 3 companies. The figures of the company commanders were so ingrained in the rank and file that there was no delay or mistakes in their reorganization. When the natives were in clear view, the whole battalion stiffened, Tanya included, for the natives were not human. They were centaurs. A horse with an upper body of a man with a lower body of a horse. Creatures thought to be a myth stood before them, their bows strung with the promise of death. In response to the natives drawing their bows, the battalion lifted their rifles. The ensuing silence was deafening to everyone. Tanya released a breath as she motioned her battalion to lower their weapons. The men did so seemingly without hesitation. The centaurs held their bows aimed and primed until a voice cut in through the silence. Lower your bows, the lead one commanded, his fellow centaurs hesitating clearly but did it nevertheless. With that, a tenser silence took hold, and Major Tanya von de Gurschaf of the 203rd Imperial Aerial Mage Battalion, Tanya spoke up first, standing straight and presenting a slight nod to the native. Unsure of their courtesy. You, the leader of the centaurs said uneasily, would lead this group of warriors, child. Tanya felt a tad bit of irritation at being called a child, but she put it behind her. After all, diplomacy requires level-headed people on both sides, and she wasn't going to be that hot-headed person. I am, she replied a bit too flatly. And I assume you lead your own group of warriors? Flattery was the quickest and easiest way to gain temporary trust from the opposing party. For a human to call us with respect, I am glad the kingdom didn't send forward unruly individuals. His eyes softened as he did a slight bow. Tanya lowered herself to his level, allowing the centaurs to not feel belittled by their higher ground. After descending, she addressed the term, kingdom? The softness and gratefulness vanished within a tenth of a second. Are you not from the kingdom? He asked suspiciously, his grip on his bow tightening. Tanya shook her head. We are not, but rest assured we come in peace. The centaur-only reaction was to tense up more. Are you, with the ones beyond the kingdom, the ones of the church? There was a growing amount of distrust in his voice. The church? Tanya inquired before shaking her head. No, she breathed. Sant-we are more than likely affiliated with a country you do not know. And Sant, country we do not know? He glanced to his fellow centaurs. I recommend you leave. I have greeted you with open arms in hopes you are affiliated with the kingdom. But I was mistaken. This is my tribe's territory, and if you aren't affiliated with the ones my forefathers forged a contract with, then we will deny you access here. Tanya was left blinking as the centaurs drew their bows once again and pointed at them. The speed at which negotiations broke down made her dumbfounded. "Should we leave, Major?" She felt a hand land on her shoulder, taking her out of her stupor. "Oh, shh." She clicked her tongue in annoyance before turning away from the centaurs and bring her radio to her lips. "This is Major von der Gurechaff to SMS Kaiser. All diplomacy has broken down and requesting orders. Over. Fall back. The Navy will deal with this. Over and out." She couldn't help but feel irked at the order. What do they mean the Navy would deal with it? Were they going to send their own diplomat to speak with the centaurs? Thunder in a clear day. The boom of massive guns being fired reached her ears as she was halfway to the fleet. The Empire was here for one thing and one thing only: conquest. Tanya turned back to the cliffs where the centaurs had stood firm in the face of the Empire's might. The sight was not pretty. The natural and smooth cliffs were marred with craters. The bodies of the deceased centaurs flew down the cliffs and splashed in the water. Arrows flew towards her battalion, but failed miserably to pierce her men's passive shields. "Major von der Gurechaff, this is SMS Kaiser, do you read? Over?" She turned her attention to the radio. "This is Major von der Gurechaff. I read you. Over." "Confirmed strike. Over." She felt a bit lightheaded, probably from the combination of the lack of comfortable sleep and jet lag. "Strike confirmed. Over." Affirmative. Over and out. She released a sigh, messaging her forehead to put the upcoming migraine to rest. "Battalion, move out." "Yes, sir. Now we are surrounded by hostile natives," Rommel hummed with Tanya as his unfortunate audience. "Well, I suppose you are a soldier through and through." Tanya bit back a rude retort at the belittlement by the general. "With all due respect, sir, it seemed that you already knew I would fail." Rommel gave Tanya a long stare, his gaze searching. "Indeed, the Admiral and I had long known that negotiations would break down immediately. The prisoner you brought in told the higher-ups as much," he revealed. "I only suspect fully trained diplomats could have any real chance at trying to sway the centaurs." Tanya stiffened at the revelation. It was a test, but for what? "Fear not, I will keep to my word," Rommel reassured, his gaze returning to the shore in which the troops disembarked upon. "You are dismissed, Major." Tanya saluted with as many relaxed muscles she could muster before heading out. Once she was out, Rommel took out a small notebook from his pocket and wrote down a few items. Once finished, he turned to the sky. Tanya sighed as she sat on one of the crates, her mind a tad bit hazy from what had occurred a few minutes prior. In the most likely case, the general's opinion must have been degraded to some degree to her inability to properly negotiate with the natives. Of course, if one were to take his words into more consideration, perhaps his opinion of her increased. There were things that Tanya herself believed warranted some praise, but of course, this could just be her pride interfering in her thoughts. "Here, Major, I brewed some coffee." Tanya looked up to see the kind smile on her adjutant's face as she handed her a mug of good-smelling coffee. "Thank you, Visha." She took the mug and took a sip. "'Tain't good as always," she praised, earning a happy smile from the lieutenant. "A young girl like you shouldn't be caught up with depression, Major." Visha spoke slowly and softly. "I mean, you still have your life ahead of you." Tanya took a sip of her coffee, letting the caffeine kick in. "Unfortunately, I might die from politics before I die from depression," she replied solemnly, half joking, of course, but not that her tone suggested it. We won't let that happen, Major," Visha declared triumphantly, puffing out her chest in stubbornness. Tanya paused from her self-depressed thoughts as she witnesses the display of fervent loyalty from her adjacent. Perhaps Visha's naive positiveness was a good thing after all. Tanya chuckled softly before shaking her head. Perhaps the true cure to depression, no matter how brief, was positive people. She then sighed, taking a sip of her coffee before resigning herself to wander the camp. "Oh, let's go do some actual work, shall we?" Visha simply beamed, as her little Major seemed more content than before. Thousands of bloodthirsty pupils eyed their new leader, the heir of the recently deceased chieftain. We of the inhabitants of the Great Plains shall not stand against the tyranny of these spirit-damned humans. We of the great people of the centaurs and our fellow brethren shall drive these humans and slaughter them to the last man. Numerous different cries of approval resounded throughout tens of thousands of mouths. Species of different races bound together not just by packs but also by their hatred of the species that caged them in and merely observed their countless wars, humans. Unbeknownst to them, a group of a few dozen figures watched the proceedings overhead. Chapter 3. Price of Iron. Even after two catastrophic defeats from both world wars, Germany in her past life still became the most advanced country in Europe since Russia. One may say it would be the sheer industrial might that the Germans overcame these defeats, and some may say it was the people, the empire though. It was the most powerful nation in the world, not just a single continent. They may not have the resources of the Russies, the vast colonial empire of the Commonwealth, nor the economic might of the unified states, but it was their mindset that made the empire powerful. Constant self-improvements to themselves and to their country, their nationalism unyielding even in the face of humiliation. And I wonder how the press will take this massacre, Tanya mused, as the explosions of hers and her battalion's explosion spells hit the centaurs and their allies with a fiery inferno. Head back. The regular army will take care of the survivors. Yes, sir. As they fixed themselves in the direction of their encampment, she couldn't help but ponder on a question. How did the centaurs' allies rally so fast? Within the confines of the Empire's House of Lords, fierce debates raged within amongst Bundestag. Why would we reduce military spending that much? Ten people cry for more attention. We currently have no threats to our borders. Such a drastic reduction in spending is necessary to speed up recovery. She will also significantly decrease the number of territories we can colonize quickly. So what? Our people need to be tended first. Our factories need to be producing goods for our people, not guns, so we can stockpile. We have a surplus of every item in our inventory. We do not need more. As the debates raged further, the Chancellor was nowhere to be seen, having been called to attention elsewhere. The Kaiser was also not seen as he didn't have an obligation to attend. All that left were squabbling politicians and a few guards to protect them. There was also Lieutenant General Rudersdorf and Lieutenant General Zetor, who watched the proceedings with wine glasses in hand, boredom on their faces. At this rate, the Empire would demilitarize, Rudersdorf remarked, puffing his cigarette with absolute boredom written on his face. We are already demilitarizing. What's the harm in putting the stop unto most of our military production? His tone was slightly sarcastic as he took a sip of his wine. Honestly, they should first take a first-hand look at our surroundings before doing something so drastic as this. Rudersdorf took a sip of his wine as well. We do need more farmland as well, he added. And I do think you're overestimating the natives too much. I received word earlier today that Major de Goroshoff has removed a whole allied army of those things. Naval shells also seem to also be able to kill them easily. And I admit, I may be paranoid, but don't you think we should first evaluate our neighbors before reaching such a conclusion? Zetor retorted. Putting that aside, now that you bring up Major de Goroshoff's recent activities, what is to be of her? Many in the military will not be too bothered with her staying, but many political figures do express concern of her status, prominently the Kaiser himself. Rudersdorf puffed his cigarette before replying. Since we could always assign her to a backline department, namely the logistical one. They are still, after all, very much grateful by the advice she has parted with them a few weeks back. A dry chuckle erupted from Zetor. To think we were struggling to keep our men supplied a few weeks ago, he remarked, taking a sip from his wine once he was done chuckling. Rudersdorf snorted. Und we have to thank Major de Goroshoff and her battalion for making it all happen. Indeed, if it weren't for her stalling the front, I doubt we would have pulled the retreat as flawlessly as we did, and there was also her dive into their central headquarters. How long do you think it will take her to reach General? As long as nothing unfortunate happens to her, way before she reaches our age, that is for sure. Tanya sneezed. What the hell? Am I really getting sick? Fortunately, her sneeze was unheard as the wind rushed past her and her battalion. Definitely, need to get that checked on. And swear, if I get sick in the air. Major, is something wrong? The sudden voice from just right beside her might have made Tanya jump if she was on the ground. Tanya took a deep breath to calm her nerves before replying, Nothing is wrong right now, but I was thinking of sending the whole battalion to the medical ward. Visha, the poor girl, misinterpreted her major's words and she became pale as a ghost. She stuttered out as she fell back a bit, enough so that she was right beside Lieutenant Weiss. Is there something wrong, Lieutenant Serebryakov? Weiss inquired curiously. I think Major might put us into another training course. The second in command became pale as a ghost as well. Ignorant of the two's growing dread, Tanya had merely raised an eyebrow before shaking her head. Of course, she would be worried. Disease is a deadly affair after all. Putting her possible sickness aside, their mission was relatively easy that befitted the lack of any major conflicts in the new land, map surveying and reconnaissance. They finally reached the breakup point. And know the drill, break up into companies and head to your selected village. Remember, remain vigilant and write down anything of note like infrastructure and mines. Despite the wind still mildly deafening her, she still heard the beautiful chorus of Bunch, yes, sir. With that, she righted herself in the general direction of the village she herself will watch, the first centaur tribe they had encountered. She did not need to look back to know that her assigned company, which consisted of herself, Visha, and 10 other members, were right behind her. As there was no haste in getting to their mission objective, she had allowed herself and her company to move at cruising speed to save mana. Yet despite this decision, 2 of her company had run out of mana and consequently forced the whole company to ground themselves only a few clicks from the village. Sending a brief annoyed glance at the 2 exhausted soldiers, she asked Visha for the map to confirm their location. Confirming that they were still on track, she turned to her squad once more. 5-minute break and then we head towards the objective on foot. Yes, sir. Sighing, she took out her canteen and took a quick swig. Today was going to be a long day. As she and her company observed the centaur village and made rough sketches for a map, they heard the distinct sounds of a propeller plane fly distantly. The villagers, who also heard the plane, started to get riled up and many had taken up arms. This development concerned her and her company. She could hear vaguely shouts of dragon from within the village. Visha, take note that there might be the existence of dragons here, she ordered as she looked through her binoculars. After all, why have some sort of protocol when such things don't exist? Simple. Dragons exist, but all oral information that is not derived from interrogation must be viewed with a grain of salt. Yes, sir. To say dragons were real was a huge security risk if they were anything like mythology depicted them on Earth. It could possibly end the whole expedition in a single night. At present, however, the centaur's hyper-awareness might get them spotted, and get away from the clearing and pack up all our gear, then climb the trees. There were confused looks, but nevertheless, they did what they were told and started to climb separate trees. As everyone settled in, Tanya felt and heard the familiar buzz of her radio. Tius is Ferry 02 to Ferry -1, do you read, over? She put away her binoculars before directing her attention to the radio. Tinus is Ferry 01, I read you, over. Sir, we have been compromised, permission to head to the rendezvous point, over. Permission granted, and do make sure not to leave your equipment, over. It was a shame, but she supposed that the particular village Wes was assigned to watch was made up of creatures of hawk people, and hawks are said to have one of the best visions in the animal kingdom. And affirmative. Before Weiss could finish his sentence, one of her company members chose the moment to cut in, Major, the centaurs are heading towards us. Tanya's eyes widened in surprise, then her radio crackled. Kiss is Ferry 4. We have been compromised, over. Ferry 6, we've been compromised. Permission to fall back, over. She felt the adrenaline kick in as she sat shocked as the mission compromisation from all the squads came flying in. Then she snapped out of it and turned to her company. Pack up everything and return to rendezvous? Yes, sir. She then turned her attention back to her radio. TIS is Ferry -1 to all of the 203rd Imperial Aerial Battalion. Head to the rendezvous point immediately. She then ignored the various yes sirs and took to the skies while setting a pace for her company. Damn it. What the hell happened? To be spotted all simultaneously was basically impossible. How did it happen? Did all the villages have radio communication? She took a moment to calm her erratic breathing and calm her nerves once more, mildly noting that it was the second time today. Once she was calm, she halted the company before addressing Visha. On to me the long calm. Lieutenant, The adjutant took a moment to fumble around with her equipment before bringing the radio to Tanya. Here you go, Major. Tanya didn't bother showing her appreciation and immediately started to speak when she brought it to her lips. TIS is Ferry 01 to operations. Do you read? Over? There was a moment of silence before it crackled once more. TIS is operations. We read you. Over. All squads have been compromised. Reporting to the rendezvous point. Over. Received. Head to rendezvous and await further instructions. Over. Affirmative. Over and out. Sighing deeply, she handed the radio back to Visha before taking off. Tanya felt the uncharacteristic nervousness get into her system before a certain general. It was the nervousness that usually came with facing an unhappy employer or executive. So, these primitives somehow have the ability to communicate long ranges? General von Rommel asked, as he looked through the assortment of notes that Tanya's company commanders had written up. Yes, sir, she affirmed. Permission to speak, sir. Sir, go ahead. Did our radios pick up anything, sir? Von Rommel tapped his finger on his desk, contemplating something. No, they did not. His mind seems to make up as he looked like he awaited something. Another question. Tanya was no expert in human behavior, but the stance that the general took made her feel like she was missing something. Did the mana sensors intercept anything? It would seem that was the right question to ask as von Rommel's face made room for a smirk. Then there was indeed an concerning mana signature passing through each village for a brief second. It was as thin as a line, but there were specific bumps that ran throughout that had allowed our sensor observers to see them. It is quite gibberish written in any language so far. Tanya's eyes widened briefly. And magical signal? Indeed, it also would seem that unlike our radios, the mana lines seem to be capable of almost instantaneous signals, perhaps at the speed of thought. And it was only because of the lengthy message that it carried with it that we were able to see it for a few seconds or record it. They had assumed that just like their normal technology, the natives' magical technology was primitive. But if these magical telegraph or a telephone was anything to go by, and I am sure you need to organize your own thoughts about this, as I do need to myself. So, you are dismissed, Major. Thousands of miles away and miles underneath the surface, a devil knelt down to a skeleton in a highly decorative office. Do you have something urgent to report, Demiurge? Chapter 4. Fire, Magic, God. With the war between the rest of the native tribes now inevitable, the path in which they were to take now was truly precarious. Tanya stared at the burning forest with disgust. An utter waste of resources, and for what? A vain attempt to light fire upon their headquarters? Her radio flared to life as Weiss reported in. Sir, the group of arsonists has been detained. Over. Copy that, bring them here. Over. A sigh slipped from her lips as she turned away from the fire. Major, headquarters wants a report, Visha said as she approached Tanya with the radio extended towards her. Grabbing the radio, Tanya equipped the headphones and brought the microphone to her lips. Tenses Major von Degroschaff reporting in. Over. So have the arsonists been detained? Over? The radio buzzed. In affirmative. Currently bringing them to be interrogated and identified. Over. She waited for a bit, and as she did so, the visible forms of the second company came into her view. Over here! Visha waved from beside Tanya, calling the company and their prisoners. Then the radio burst into life once more. Mo copy that, sending transportation to your area, ETA 10 minutes, over and out. Visha, she said simply, handing over the radio to the bubbly girl's hands. Then, Tanya focused her attention solely on the detained goatmen things, their bar-like pupils blazing with defiance as their hooved feet dangled in the air. Why did you burn down the forest? She asked with impunity, as if she was berating one of her own, not even allowing them to speak, if they even were. She continued her barbed words. For sheer stupidity astounds me. Did your brains not evolve alongside your bodies? Allowing a small lull in her berating, the most impassionate goatman spat at her. The ball of saliva did nothing as it splattered against her shield. Following this act of defiance, Weiss and another mage tightened their grip over the arms of the goatman. Major, the transports are here, Visha revealed, pointing to the single truck navigating through the devastated forest. Tanya nodded, descending to the ground while still facing their most defiant prisoner. Tarn, thank you for doing a few months of work for us, she stated, a smug smile forming on her face. Jote, boat, brains. Another goatman drew her attention as it struggled against her men's grip. Head off me, you human trash. You dare disrespect the Great Spirit's sacrifice, he screamed in pure outrage. In thanks to their sacrifice that— Silence! Roared the goatman who spat, his eyes glaring at his compatriot. Tanya stared at the goatman before sighing. Truly, what was their goal? A distraction? Or perhaps a foolish attempt to wipe them out? To be honest, what the goatman had done benefited the expedition greatly. With a vast clearing now available due to the mass deforestation, one of the advantages the natives held was gone. Sir, we shall now take the prisoners, one of the soldiers who had disembarked from the transport truck said, his boots crunching against the crisped wood. And treat them well. They did us a great service after all, Tanya snarkily replied, pure smugness emanating from her voice despite the straight expression plastered on her face. Behind her, her men snickered a bit. What, you foolish goats? Deep within the forest, far from the prying eyes of the human aircraft and patrols, 4 various creatures sat around a massive campfire. Around them, large stones with intricate carvings seemingly isolated them from the dozens of various kin that surrounded them. Taking the stage, a hawk-like creature pointed his talon at the representative goatmen. To dare defile the great forest and name it a sacrifice? It screeched. Calm yourself, bird shit, the goatman returned evenly, his hands gripping into fists. Calm myself? The hawkman screeched furiously. Poor people doomed our only viable strategy in defeating these humans. Your plan was stupid anyway, the leading centaur commented snidely. The magicians are slippery and strong. We cannot attack them directly. Instead, we need to merely confine them to their cowardly walls. The hawkman turned his eyes furiously upon the centaur. How will we do that then, O great Kukte? He asked mockingly. If your brains ain't in your ass, need I remind you of their metal dragons? The skies in which we hawkmen called home is no longer safe for us. Pen is your problem, shitbrains, the goatman scoffed. In is not shitbrains, you little goat shit, the hawkman roared furiously. Angled Claw, stop your yabbering. The 4th demi-human spoke up, its strong, deep voice seemingly cutting through the hawkman's anger. If all you guys are to do is squabble, then I shall head home. Pinot, please do stay for a bit longer, Osigrador. The centaur, Kukte, implored impassively, his tone not that of pleading but akin to a kind gentleman asking his patients to stay. Am sure your village is well secured by your strong orcish women. Secured or not, if I come home deafened, my wives will eat me alive, Osigrador commented lightly. His massive figure relaxed, despite the previous tension of the group. And by the way, when are we doing that rematch? Kukte raised an eyebrow at the orc's words. Want to do it after we expel the humans or before? He inquired. Meanwhile, the hawkman, Angled Claw, looked at both of them with disbelief and irate anger. You are making light of the situation? Need I remind you that the tribal confederation of the plains was obliterated? The hegemon was destroyed. How could you all be calm? Kukte merely sighed as he got up, his strong, bristling body towering over the hawkmen. And what will you have us do? He asked. Fight, of course. Struggle. If we cannot defend... Have you seen what carnage their mages wrought? Tell me, have your warriors taken down a single one of their metal birds? At this simple question, Angled Claw snapped. All their power lay in their mages, he yelled as he stepped right up to the centaur. Without them, they are weak. Weaker than even the weakest of the humans from the kingdom. My men even slaughtered 100 of them already. And 100? Have you become delusional? The goatman spoke up, disinterest now firmly the attitude of all three leaders. Osigradur, who was already bored, gruffed in growing irritation. Ton enough, this is just a waste of time. Kukte, just send the envoy. Genvoy? Kukte asked in confusion before realization dawned upon him. Joe, we gonna make peace? Make peace? Angled Claude asked in utter confusion. Make peace? He roared indignantly. Make... The hawkman's words were cut off mysteriously, his body freezing in mid-speech. All three of the other leaders looked at the still hawkman with surprise. In his brain fry itself from his stupidity? Osigradur asked with a dismissive huff as he disregarded his shock. He then leaned back on his chair as if mildly amused at the turn of events. Kukte approached Angled Claw with a hesitant concern. He extended his hand out to touch the hawkman's shoulder. But when he did, a look of confusion flashed on his face. Meanwhile, the goatman looked around him and spotted some things in particular, and the leaves have stopped in midair. At his words, Osigradur and Kukte looked around themselves as well. Guards, Kukte called out, expecting a callback or the sound of his men, only for silence to greet him. Do you feel powerless? Everyone froze at those ominous words and the mismatching voice now echoing from Angled Claw's mouth. As usual, Osigradur was the first to respond. Who the fuck are you? He asked seriously, his voice now dismissing its previously lax tone. Sir an orc, your intelligence is indeed an intriguing trait. A smart orc is a powerful orc if I don't say so myself, the voice from Angled Claw said. As the voice spoke, Angled Claw's body moved. It moved past Kukte and towards the orc only to be stopped by the arm of the centaur. Stop playing tricks, Angled Claw, Kukte threatened, as his impressive bulk flexed themselves in intimidation. Yeah, we ain't falling for your bloating, the goatman chimed in. Yet Angled Claw merely froze in place, his body stilling like before. I'm curious, however, how will you break the news to your war-hungry brethren? The voice spoke up at this time from the beak of a bird flying above them. Craning their necks, they were all taken aback at the supernatural occurrence. Then conclusions were drawn. Get down here, sorcerer, oh great spirit. Forgive our insolence. While the two long-legged mammals babbled insults and reverence, Osigradur looked at the creature with a cool disposition. If my brethren have a problem with my decisions, the right of combat is always on the table, he intoned as he sat up while grabbing a rock from the floor. But my brethren are not dumb, and nor do they seek war truly. They have things to protect, women at home, and children to foster. Do not mistake our strength for barbarism. He then threw the rock he held at the bird with nigh neck-breaking speed. It struck the bird, splitting the poor animal with only its head and feet remaining. Yet its carcass remained suspended and presumably alive. The goatman looked on in horror at the action. You strike the great spirit, he cried in shock. But what if I give you the power to push back? Tanya rolled her shoulders as she awoke. Her mind was a bit muddled from the lack of routine caffeine. Here you go, Major, Visha chirped with a steaming mug of coffee. If there was anything Tanya loved more than capitalism, it was the competence of attentive workers. Thank you, she said in somewhat sloppy appreciation, grabbing the mug with a bit cheerier disposition. So, how's the weather today? She asked as she sipped it. Visha poked her head out of the tent for a bit before bringing it back in. It's clear today, she reported as she fished something from her pocket. Sugar? Tanya looked at her lieutenant's outstretched hand, now holding pouches of sugar. Merely humming in response, she grabbed them and opened some to pour them into her coffee. Seemingly satisfied with her duty now complete, Visha smiled as she sat down on her bed and watched Tanya drink her coffee. She hummed happily as she swayed like an excited child. "What's with the overly cheery attitude?" Tanya inquired with a raised eyebrow as she sipped her coffee. "Well, it looks like we're going back to the fatherland," Visha revealed with the giddiness of a child. Lenore Company was on the roster for redeployment back home. The Tanya looked at Visha with surprise, as she did not know about the news. "Sinai was not told of this," she said in minor surprise. Visha, even seeing the surprised look on Tanya's face, did not damper her excitement as she said, "And I heard it was a surprise command from the government." "And surprise command?" Tanya asked in confusion. "Well, the officers I spoke to said that the Kaiser himself issued it." "Are we going to be replaced?" "Not that I know of." Tanya thought on the subject a bit, her mind weighing if it was a sound decision or not. On one hand, removing a chunk of the fighting capabilities of the force will hamper the expansionary capabilities of the mission. On the other, it would seem that the Kaiser himself was satisfied in the annihilation of what seemingly was the natives' full force, which, she must admit, was a tad bit foolish in thinking. After all, it was said that the Native American civilization, especially that of the Mayans, had a higher population even that of France or all of Europe. So a measly 1,000 of troops would surely hamper them, but not take them out of the fight. And as far as she was aware, they were still fighting a guerrilla war against the other natives who were mostly intact from the Tupin battles. She shook her head in disapproval, but when she looked at Visha, who was still waiting for a concrete reaction, she sighed. "Well, did you get a date?" Even though she knew she was needed here, she had to remember that morale was an integral part of a person's performance. Some extended downtime would surely alleviate their spirits. Besides, she was most likely overthinking things. After all, she was sure that whatever mage battalion that replaced them should be enough to hold off any native forces, and there were also the unused artillery shells and machine gun magazines lazing around their positions. After all, what can the natives do against the might of the Empire?
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I truly appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this content and want to see more, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for future updates. Your support means the world to me.